What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That question hovered, unspoken, as Walter Harris sat alone in his dim kitchen, the sound of a ticking clock louder than it should be. Outside, the wind scraped dry leaves across the sidewalk like brittle bones. He stirred a can of chicken noodle soup with a chipped spoon, ignoring the ache in his left hand. The heat from the stove wasn't doing much to warm the room, but he was used to the cold, just like he was used to the silence. The walls around him bore the fading color of better times. Old wallpaper his late wife had chosen still clung in places, curling at the corners like memories trying to peel away. He brought the spoon to his mouth, the soup bland and lukewarm. He'd forgotten to add salt again. Halfway through the second bite, it hit. A sharp pressure behind his left eye. Not a headache. Deeper. Like something inside him was trying to short-circuit. His hand twitched. The spoon clattered against the bowl, and his body stiffened. For a second, maybe 5, he couldn't move. Just sat there, breath shallow, staring at nothing. Then it passed. Just like that. He blinked and looked down at his trembling fingers, heart pounding, his breath catching in the back of his throat like he'd just come up from deep water. He waited. But nothing more came. Just the silence and that damn ticking clock. He reached for his phone, the old flip kind with a cracked screen, and dialed his daughter's number. It rang twice, then voicemail. "Hey, Sarah, it's Dad. Just, thought I'd check in. Not feeling great. Anyway, give me a ring when you get this, okay?" He hung up, then dropped the phone onto the table, its plastic body thudding softly against the wood. He stared at the dark window across from him, his own reflection barely visible. An old man with white stubble, hollow cheeks, and eyes too tired for hope stared back. "This can't be it," he muttered. From the living room, a voice broke the silence. He'd left the TV on again. One of those long tech interviews on YouTube had been playing before he went to the kitchen. A man's voice, calm, measured, unmistakable, echoed through the house. "The brain isn't static. It's not a machine that wears out. It's more like software. And software can be upgraded." Walt turned his head, slowly, as if afraid moving too fast would break something. The screen showed Elon Musk, sitting in a black chair, talking with quiet confidence. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't performing. He was telling the truth. We can expand what's possible. Even for people who think they've hit their limits. Neuralink isn't just about helping those with brain injuries. It's about unlocking the next version of ourselves. Walt leaned forward slightly. That sentence, unlocking the next version of ourselves, hit like a tuning fork inside his chest. Something deep, almost forgotten, hummed to life. He stood, slowly, his knees cracking, and shuffled into the living room. The feed was still going, Elon's voice calm but electric. "You're more than your biology. The brain can evolve." He stood there, staring at the screen like it had called him by name. He didn't know what Neuralink was. Not really. Something about chips in your head. High-tech nonsense for rich kids and startups. But that sentence, the way he said it, it didn't sound like a pitch. It sounded like a promise. He turned off the TV. Sat in his old recliner. The pain behind his eye had faded, but something else had taken its place, a sharp awareness of how still everything had become. How small his world was. How predictable. It wasn't the fear of dying that made him afraid. It was the fear that he'd already stopped living and just hadn't noticed. His mind drifted, uninvited, to the garage. To the old workbench where his past sat gathering dust and rust. To the thing he hadn't touched in over 30 years. The prototype. Back when he thought he could fix something bigger than himself. Back when his hands still believed they could build the future. He used to believe in the idea that machines could restore dignity to broken bodies. A motorized prosthetic that moved like a real hand. It was ahead of its time. Too far ahead, maybe. The VA didn't want it. Said it was unreliable. Too risky. He still remembered the feel of the rejection letter in his hands, how heavy it was despite the paper being thin. That was the first time he gave up. One of many. He reached for his cane, stood slowly, and walked to the kitchen window. The moon was up, casting silver light over the frost on the grass. He thought of his son, Kyle, who hadn't spoken to him in 6 years. Thought of the last words between them, sharp, angry, final. Thought of Sarah, always too busy, always somewhere else. And he thought of the way Musk had said it, not with hype, but with certainty, "You're more than your biology." Walt whispered it to the window. Tried it on for size. Didn't sound like him. But maybe it could. The next morning, he woke up with a tension in his chest that felt like grief. Or maybe hunger. He didn't know which. The tremor in his left hand was worse. He stared at it for a long time before forcing it into stillness. Then, on impulse, he did something small but different. He picked up his phone, not to call Sarah, not to check the weather, but to look up Neuralink. The text was dense. Scientific. Too much jargon. But beneath it all was something clear: they were trying to make broken things work again. Not just machines. People. And the people trying. They weren't waiting for permission. He closed the phone. Stared out the window again. A blue jay landed on the porch rail, fluffed its feathers, then took off. He turned toward the garage. The air was cool and smelled of dust and metal. A part of him felt foolish. The rest of him felt awake. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, the podcast host had said before introducing Musk's clip. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Walt didn't subscribe. He didn't comment. But he thought about the question all the same. And as his hand trembled over the prototype, he whispered, "Because I still can." That night, as he lay in bed, he didn't think about soup or silence or ticking clocks. He thought about software. About upgrades. About the parts of him that might still be writable. Somewhere in the world, men like Musk were reaching for the stars. Walt wasn't trying to leave the planet. He just wanted to come back to life. The pain in his hand was still there. But it wasn't the loudest thing anymore. Something else had taken its place. Something he hadn't heard in years. Possibility. The morning came without ceremony. No birdsong. No sunrise worth watching. Just a dull gray smear across the sky that made everything feel heavier than it already was. Walter Harris sat at the edge of his bed, his hand resting on his knee, the joints in his fingers stiff like cold steel. His body felt like it had been through a war, and in many ways, it had. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble scratching his palm, and reached down to pull on his wool socks, the kind his wife used to fold neatly into drawers before her body gave out and left him folding everything alone. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he walked toward the bathroom. No mirrors in there anymore. He'd taken the last one down 3 years ago. Said it was cracked, but truth was, he just got tired of looking at someone who no longer looked like him. After brushing his teeth and swallowing the usual 6 pills with a glass of warm tap water, he wandered into the kitchen, flicked on the old coffee pot, and leaned against the counter while it sputtered to life. The silence, once a comfort, now felt like another weight pressing on his chest. The silence had names: Sarah, who only called on birthdays; Kyle, who didn't call at all; and Judith, who had been the last person to ever look at him like he was still worth something. The garage called to him like a church. It was the only room that still remembered who he was. He stepped into the space with reverence, the smell of oil and sawdust filling his lungs. The workbench sat under a dusty shop light, tools arranged in the exact way he'd left them years ago, because he didn't know how not to keep order. Order gave him the illusion that something still mattered. He touched the edge of the half-finished prosthetic and flinched when he saw how corroded the wires had become. His invention. His failure. Once, long ago, it had a name, GRIP, Guided Response Intelligent Prosthetic. He'd worked on it for 5 years after the war, convinced he could build something to help men like him, men who'd left pieces of themselves on foreign soil. He was a machinist by trade but a dreamer by necessity. He used to believe that if he couldn't fix his own wounds, maybe he could fix someone else's. He built the first prototype in 1982 with salvaged parts, copper wiring, and more hope than expertise. It looked like a robotic hand, but what it represented was something bigger, the idea that you didn't have to be whole to matter. He submitted the design to the VA, full of nerves and trembling hands. They turned him down flat. Said it was unreliable, untested, impractical. That word stuck with him, impractical. It became the blade that severed him from his purpose. He never built another one after that. He went back to work at the factory, back to cutting and welding and clocking in and out like a ghost in steel-toed boots. Time passed. His daughter grew up. His son drifted away. Judith died. The house got quieter. The prototype sat untouched, collecting dust. He stopped believing he could change anything. Until yesterday. Until the voice on the screen said, "The brain isn't static." That sentence had been echoing in his head like a hymn. That a man like Musk, someone who lived in the clouds and reached for Mars, was still obsessed with fixing the human body, still believed in upgrading the ordinary man, well, that did something to Walt. It made him feel like maybe he wasn't entirely obsolete. Maybe he was just paused. Like a machine left in sleep mode. He picked up a screwdriver and tightened one of the joints on the prototype. His hands trembled, but he got it done. Then he reached for the soldering iron, its cord brittle with age. He plugged it in and waited. Nothing. The tip stayed cold. He muttered under his breath, dug through an old drawer, and found a second iron, older than the first. That one worked. The smell of heated metal filled the room, familiar and grounding. He worked for an hour, just enough to feel something shift inside him. Not the hand, not yet, but something deeper. His thoughts. His posture. His memory. Like a light coming back on in a forgotten hallway. When the tremor in his hand got too bad, he set the tool down and leaned back, catching his breath. He glanced at the old photograph on the wall, him in uniform, Judith at his side, her hand on his chest like she was trying to keep his heart safe inside it. The radio on the shelf crackled to life as he turned the dial to the news. More war. More division. More people screaming about things they didn't understand. He turned it off. Sat in the quiet. Then, something strange happened. He found himself walking over to the desk and opening his laptop. A gift from Sarah 2 Christmases ago, still in near new condition because he'd never really used it. He typed Neuralink into the search bar and clicked through articles and videos, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand. Brain-machine interface. Real-time neural data. Restoring movement to paralyzed limbs. Treating Alzheimer's, PTSD, even depression. It was heavy stuff. But buried in the technical talk was a single phrase that caught his breath. Neuralink is not just about restoring function. It's about restoring identity. That hit him hard. He wasn't trying to be 20 again. He wasn't trying to be someone he never was. He just wanted to feel like himself again. Like he had something to give. Something to fix. He closed the laptop and stared out the garage window, where the sky was still gray but brighter somehow. There was work to do. He spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the bench, oiling the gears, testing joints, replacing wires. It was slow, clumsy work, and the pain in his back reminded him every few minutes that he was no longer the man in that photograph. But the ache felt different today. Not like punishment, more like proof that he was still in the game. That night, He sat with a microwave dinner and called Sarah again. Voicemail. Again. Hey, it's Dad. Just thinking about things lately. I fixed part of the old project today. Remember that one from way back? The hand? Anyway, just thought you should know. I'm not sure why. He hung up. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he opened an old email draft he'd never sent to Kyle. It had been sitting there for years, unsent, unfinished. It read. I know I wasn't always fair to you. I know I was hard. But I was trying. I miss you. I really do. He stared at it, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then he typed, I'm working on something again. The old hand. Don't laugh. I think I'm finally going to finish it. I'd love to talk. He hit send. The moment after was quiet and loud at the same time. He looked at his hands, raw and reddened from hours in the garage, and for the first time in years, he felt useful. Not fixed. Not healed. But useful. Like a gear in a bigger machine, just waiting to be turned again. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, the sound of Musk's voice played faintly in his mind, you're more than your biology. The brain can evolve. Walt believed it. Not because of science. Not because of tech. But because somewhere deep in the rust of his old bones, something was beginning to move again. The doctor's office smelled like antiseptic and sadness, and the walls were painted that same muted beige that every medical building seemed to agree on, like they were trying to make you feel calm by making everything feel lifeless. Walter Harris sat on the crinkly paper stretched across the exam table, his hands resting on his knees, gripping the edge like he might float away if he didn't hold on. He hated this room. Hated the posters of food pyramids and reminders to check for moles. Hated the way the light overhead was just a little too bright, like it was interrogating him. Most of all, he hated how small he felt here. Like he was a problem to be managed, not a man to be understood. Dr. Brent finally came in, flipping through his digital tablet, not even looking up until the door was fully closed. He was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, efficient, the kind of man who probably drank smoothies for breakfast and ran half marathons on weekends. He gave a brief nod. Mr. Harris. Looks like the results are in. Walt nodded once, silent, his eyes locked on a crack in the floor tile. Dr. Brent scrolled. Blood pressure's up. Cholesterol stubborn. MRI showed some age-related changes, but nothing alarming. You mentioned a brief episode of numbness and eye pressure. Walt gave a grunt of acknowledgement. Felt like someone was squeezing the left side of my head. Any slurred speech? Vision loss? Nope. Just a minute of not being able to move right. Then it passed. Brent nodded. Sounds like a transient ischemic attack. A mini-stroke. Not uncommon at your age. Walt blinked slowly. So, what's the plan? The doctor tapped a few times on the screen. We'll increase your statin dosage. Add a low-dose aspirin regimen. I'm also going to recommend you take it easy, limit strenuous activity, watch your diet, cut down on red meat if possible. What about the shaking in my hand? Walt asked, holding it out slightly. Could be essential tremor. Could be early Parkinson's. It's hard to say. It's not severe enough to require intervention right now. We'll monitor it. And the mini-stroke? We'll keep an eye on your blood pressure. Maybe do a follow-up MRI in 6 months. Walt waited. That was it? Anything else I should be doing? The doctor shrugged. That shrug. That was the thing that did it. Not the diagnosis. Not the pills. Not the waiting. It was the shrug. Like this was just the way things go. The world turns, the body fails, and nobody expects much from you anymore. That shrug held everything Walt had feared for years. You're old. Slow down. Stay in your lane. Let time do what time does. That's it? Walt asked, his voice low but firm. Brent looked up, finally making real eye contact. You're doing well for your age. Just keep taking your meds and try not to overdo it. You're lucky, really. Some men your age are in much worse shape. Walt's jaw tightened. Lucky. Sure. He was lucky to be standing in this beige box, waiting to die slowly under the polite gaze of a man who didn't see a machinist, a soldier, a father, or an inventor, just a list of symptoms in an aging body. He stood up, a little too fast, the paper on the exam table ripping under him. Thanks, Doc, he said, already moving toward the door. I'll see you in 6 months, I guess. Take care, Mr. Harris, Brent said, already looking at the next file on his screen. Outside, the air was hot and sticky, and the parking lot shimmered in the August sun. Walt climbed into his truck, slammed the door shut, and sat with the engine off for a long time. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and his chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, teeth grinding. A shrug. That's what 73 years got you. A shrug and a bottle of pills. He turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, and he pulled out of the lot, not heading home but toward the library, a place he hadn't visited in over a decade. It wasn't about books. It was about internet access. He needed to watch that interview again, the one with Musk. The words had been echoing in his head for days, but now they felt urgent. He parked, climbed the stairs slowly, and nodded to the teen behind the desk who barely glanced up. He sat down at a public terminal, signed in with the generic login, and typed in the video title he remembered, Elon Musk on Neuralink, Consciousness, and the Future of the Brain. The video loaded. There he was, Elon, calm and unblinking, speaking like someone who saw the world in code and light. What we're trying to do, Elon said, is bridge the gap between man and machine, not to replace the brain, but to empower it. To take control of our own evolution. People think of aging as inevitable decline, but it doesn't have to be. What if we treated the mind the way we treat software? What if we could debug it? Walt sat still, watching. Not blinking. The video played on. Elon talked about early trials with brain-computer interfaces, about helping people with spinal injuries walk again, about giving voice to the voiceless. You don't have to be a scientist to be part of this, he said. You just have to believe that limits are negotiable. That last part hit hard. Limits are negotiable. Walt turned the volume down and stared at the screen, the image of Elon frozen mid-sentence. The library hummed softly with the sound of printers and distant whispers, but in his head, the room was silent. For years, Walt had let others tell him what his limits were. Too old to matter. Too stubborn to change. Too late to fix what he'd broken. And maybe those things had been true once. But not today. Not after that shrug. Not after hearing the word lucky like it was a consolation prize. He printed out 3 pages of notes from the Neuralink site. Technical specs. Case studies. Experimental protocols. He didn't understand most of it, but he understood enough to know one thing: people were still trying. Still building. Still pushing. And if they could, so could he. Back home, he opened the garage door again and stood at the threshold. The prototype sat where he left it. Wires exposed. Limbs frozen. A relic of a dream that had never gotten off the ground. He grabbed a rag and wiped down the workbench. Cleaned the metal. Sorted the tools. He found the old user manual he'd written years ago, hand-drawn diagrams, flowcharts, notes in the margins. His own handwriting, shaky now, but still legible. He ran his finger over the title, Grip, Gen 1. It was time to make Gen 2. That night, he didn't call Sarah. Didn't try Kyle again. Instead, He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and opened a new tab. Google, basic coding for mechanical actuators. Then another, 3D printing prosthetic parts tutorial. Then another, Neuralink applications for prosthetics, explained. The words were hard. The science, harder. But Walt wasn't afraid of hard. He'd done hard before. The war was hard. Losing Judith was hard. Getting old was hard. Learning something new. That wasn't hard. That was unfamiliar. And unfamiliar wasn't the same as impossible. He made a list. A plan. He'd work 1 hour a day, minimum. He'd test one joint per week. He'd finish the hand. Not because it would change the world. Not even because anyone would care. But because it mattered to him. Because the doctor's shrug told him no one else expected him to try. And that was exactly why he would. As he shut the laptop and reached to turn off the light, he whispered it again, softer this time, like a mantra, limits are negotiable. The hinges of the garage door groaned like an old man stretching after a long sleep, sunlight slicing through the dust in golden shafts that illuminated the forgotten corners of Walt's workshop. He stood at the threshold for a long time, staring into the cluttered shadows like a man revisiting the scene of a crime. It had been years since he'd really touched anything in there, really used the space for what it was meant for. Not just a dumping ground for rusted rakes and old coffee cans filled with screws that didn't match anything anymore. This room had once been alive. Vibrant. An extension of his hands, of his thoughts. Now it felt like a tomb. But he wasn't here to mourn it anymore. He was here to wake it up. He stepped forward and turned on the shop light. It buzzed, then flickered into life, casting a yellow glow over the mess. The old metal bench was still sturdy, even if the surface bore the scars of decades, nicks, burns, stains, dents. His tools hung on the pegboard like soldiers standing at attention, many of them coated in a fine layer of grime. On the bench sat the remains of the grip prototype, a metal hand, half-articulated, with servo motors that hadn't turned since Reagan was president. Its fingers were curled slightly, as if it were holding onto something invisible. It was rough, jagged in places, more concept than product, but to Walt, it was a piece of his soul rendered in steel and wire. He reached out and ran his hand over it. The edges were sharper than he remembered, the steel cold to the touch. He found the old schematic rolled up in the bottom drawer of his workbench, yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was his own, tight and meticulous. Labels pointed to each joint, each sensor, each planned improvement he never got to make. He sat down on the worn stool and stared at the diagram, the past rushing back in pieces. He remembered the long nights after work, building alone with a transistor radio humming old country songs in the background. He remembered Judith bringing him coffee in a blue ceramic mug, the same one that now lived in the kitchen cabinet, untouched. She would lean against the doorframe and ask questions about the wires and circuits, even though she never really understood any of it. She didn't need to. She understood him. He remembered the way she had smiled when he first showed her the prototype closing its fingers, how she had looked at him like he'd just pulled a miracle out of thin air. He also remembered the day the letter came back from the VA, cold. Formal. Rejected. We appreciate your submission, but due to safety concerns and lack of institutional support, we are unable to proceed with testing at this time. The words had hit like a hammer. That was the last time he really believed in the thing. Until now. He exhaled slowly, pushed the past aside, and grabbed a rag. The next hour was cleaning. Reorganizing. Reacquainting himself with tools that had become strangers. He found 3 broken wire strippers, 2 rusted soldering irons, a battery tester that still worked, and a box full of stepper motors he'd forgotten he owned. He moved like a man clearing a minefield, slow, deliberate, careful not to throw away anything that might still have value. That was the thing about old parts. Most people saw junk. Walt saw possibilities. Every stripped screw and mismatched nut was part of something that could be. The prototype had survived surprisingly well, but its sensors were outdated, and most of the wiring had corroded. The outer shell was sound, though, brushed aluminum, light but durable. He hooked up a power source and tapped the small motor on the index finger. Nothing. Not even a twitch. He wasn't surprised. The servos were probably locked up or dead. But still, he smiled. "We'll get there," he said softly, as if the hand were listening. He made a checklist on the back of an old electric bill: new servos, updated sensors, better grip tension, flexible joint material, wiring replacements, software refresh. He had no idea where to begin with the software, but he'd figure it out. One screw at a time. He spent the afternoon researching parts on his laptop, bookmarking cheap replacements and reading tutorials on DIY prosthetic design. He found a forum for retired engineers working on open-source medical devices and bookmarked that too. A user named GraceMachinist88 had posted detailed schematics for a wrist rotation mechanism using parts that Walt already had. He made a mental note to message her later. It was strange, being online like this. He wasn't used to asking questions, not anymore. He'd grown up in a world where you figured things out or you didn't. But now, with 1,000 voices sharing knowledge for free, it felt like being handed tools by invisible hands. By dinner, his eyes were blurry from the screen, his back sore, and his hands shaking more than usual. He popped 2 Tylenol and heated up a frozen lasagna, but even as he chewed through the overcooked edges, his mind was still in the garage. He couldn't stop thinking about the servo issue. After dinner, he returned to the workbench and removed the prototype's index finger housing with a small hex wrench. The motor inside had seized completely, locked in place by time. He grunted as he worked it loose, pieces of grime flaking off like dead skin. Once it was out, he compared it to one of the newer motors he had found in a drawer, slightly smaller, different connector, but manageable. He adjusted the housing, added a brace, and installed the new unit. It fit. Not perfect, but good enough for a test. He wired it to the battery tester and flipped the switch. The finger twitched. Just once, like a muscle remembering how to move. Walt's breath caught in his throat. It was nothing, barely movement. But it was alive. He laughed, not a loud laugh, more like a disbelieving chuckle, the kind that creeps up from your gut when something surprises you in the best possible way. It worked. A piece of it worked. For a few minutes, he forgot about the doctor. Forgot about the pills. Forgot about the tremor. He was back in the rhythm of creation, back in the joy of making something do what it was never supposed to do. The hours passed without him noticing. He replaced 2 more motors, rigged a temporary control system using a salvaged joystick, and got 3 fingers to curl at once. Clumsy, inconsistent, but moving. He filmed a short video with his phone, just 10 seconds of the hand opening and closing. He didn't know why. Maybe to prove to himself it had happened. Maybe for something else. Later, as he lay in bed, sore and exhausted, he opened the video again. The hand moved just like he'd imagined it would all those years ago. Slow, deliberate, clunky, but it moved. A thought struck him. He opened his email. Found the address for his son, still there, still valid, last reply from 7 years ago. He hesitated. Then he attached the video and typed just 4 words, "Look what I fixed." He hovered over the send button, heart pounding. Then clicked it. The screen went dark. The house was silent. But inside him, something stirred. Not pride, not yet. But momentum. And for a man who'd spent years standing still, momentum felt like flight. The fluorescent lights of Handytown flickered like they were trying to decide whether to stay alive or give up. Walt Harris pushed a metal cart through the front doors, its wheels rattling across the scuffed linoleum. The store smelled like cardboard and old plastic, and the air conditioning blasted out at full power despite the fact that it was already cool outside. Walt paused by the entrance, scanning the overhead signs for the electrical section. Nothing in this place ever made sense, aisles mislabeled, shelves half-stocked, employees too busy pretending not to see you. He started walking. Aisle 1, paint. Aisle 2, plumbing. Aisle 3, lawn and garden. He finally found the section he needed near the back wall, electrical and tools, but not before brushing past 3 unattended pallets and 2 customers who moved as if he were made of fog. No one looked at him. No one said hello. No one asked if he needed help. A young guy in a blue apron stood near the batteries, scrolling on his phone, earbuds in. Walt stopped a few feet away, waiting for him to notice. Nothing. He cleared his throat. The kid didn't blink. Walt took a step closer. "Excuse me." The young man startled slightly, yanked an earbud out. "Yeah. I'm looking for soldering flux. Paste, not liquid. And wire, 22 gauge, stranded." The kid blinked slowly, chewing on the inside of his cheek. I think that's over there." He pointed vaguely to a shelf about 20 feet away and shoved the earbud back in before Walt could say another word. Walt stared at the kid's back as he walked away, some bitter thought forming at the edge of his tongue, but he let it die there. What would be the point? He walked toward the indicated shelf and found a chaotic mess, boxes of wire, half-open spools, flux tubes crushed like toothpaste. He picked through the debris until he found one small tube of flux that hadn't hardened and a single spool of wire tucked behind a packet of Christmas light timers. He shook his head. Once upon a time, this kind of place would have been his kingdom. He would have walked through these aisles like a man visiting old friends. Now it was like trying to read a language that no one spoke anymore. At the checkout line, he waited behind a man with 3 power drills and a Bluetooth speaker. The cashier, a woman in her 20s with tired eyes and chipped purple nail polish, didn't look up until she had to tell him the total. When it was Walt's turn, she scanned the flux and the wire without a word. "You all stocked up on everything else?" she mumbled. Walt forced a smile. Trying to bring something back to life. She didn't laugh, didn't even look up. "That'll be $18.47. He handed over a 20. She gave him change and a receipt without eye contact. "Have a good one," she said out of habit. "You too," Walt replied, but she was already turning to the next customer. He walked out into the parking lot feeling like a ghost. People passed him without noticing. Doors closed behind him without a sound. A man bumped his shoulder without apology. And suddenly he felt it, the weight of invisibility. Not just being old, but being irrelevant. Like society had already decided he'd had his turn. Like he was background noise. He sat in his truck for a long time, the bag resting on the seat beside him. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just stared at his own hands on the steering wheel, knuckles spotted and veins raised like road maps. Hands that had built engines, repaired HVAC systems, carved Thanksgiving turkeys. Hands that had once held his children, his wife, his future. Now they trembled when he tightened a screw. He drove home in silence. No music. No talk radio. Just the sound of the tires humming against the road and the occasional tick of the turn signal. Back in the garage, he spread out the new supplies on the workbench and took inventory. The wire was cheap. The flux already smelled a little off. But it would do. He got to work replacing a few of the older connections, reflowing solder where the joints had gone dull or cracked. The garage filled with that familiar scent, hot metal and burned resin, a perfume he hadn't realized he missed. The prototype responded better than before. The new wire conducted cleanly, and he managed to get all 5 fingers to flex at once, though they still jerked more than flowed. It was progress. He filmed another short clip and saved it to a folder on his laptop labeled, Grip Project, second try. He debated sending it to Sarah or Kyle but closed the window instead. They hadn't replied yet. He didn't want to start hoping. Later that night, unable to sleep, he opened YouTube and typed Neuralink and prosthetics into the search bar. He found a TED-style talk from one of Musk's engineers, a woman with bright eyes and a voice that cracked with emotion as she described giving movement back to a paraplegic man through brain signals alone. He reached for his daughter's hand, she said. For the first time in 13 years. Walt paused the video. He stared at the screen, breathing slowly. Something tightened in his chest, but it wasn't fear this time. It was longing. Not for mobility or fame or applause. For connection. That's what this was really about. Not technology. Not revenge against time. But connection. A chance to feel useful. A chance to offer someone else that moment, to reach again. He thought of the VA letter. He thought of the cashier who didn't look at him. The kid in Handytown who pointed like he was asking a vending machine for change. They weren't bad people. They just couldn't see him. And in their eyes, he didn't exist. But he knew something they didn't. He wasn't done. He wasn't obsolete. He had value, experience, time, wisdom, and a set of hands that still knew how to make broken things work. He remembered something Elon had said in another interview, the problem isn't age. It's permission. Most people are waiting for someone to tell them it's okay to still dream. Walt whispered into the dark, I'm done waiting. The next morning, he woke up early. Earlier than usual. Before the birds. Before the light. He made coffee, pulled on his work boots, and went into the garage with a blank sheet of paper. He was going to redesign the wrist. The first version had been too rigid. He needed flexibility, responsiveness, something that could mirror the natural twist and pitch of the human joint. He remembered a trick from his factory days, using a ball-and-socket approach with a tension sleeve. He started sketching. The lines came slow at first, then faster. Shapes. Notes. Arrows. Possibility. He worked for 4 hours before stopping to stretch his back and grab a banana. The phone buzzed on the table. A number he didn't recognize. He answered anyway. Hello. Silence. Then a familiar voice, low and hesitant. Hey. It's Kyle. Walt nearly dropped the phone. Kyle. Yeah. I saw your email. The video. I've been meaning to write back. Just didn't know what to say. Walt swallowed hard. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to see it. Another pause. Then Kyle's voice, softer now. It's pretty amazing. I showed it to a friend of mine who works at a tech lab up in Oregon. He said it's crude but full of potential. Said you might be onto something. Walt felt his chest rise. Not with pride, possibility. It's not much, he said. Just scraps and screws. Yeah, well, Kyle said, scraps and screws built a lot of good things. Listen. I'd like to come down. Maybe help. If that's okay. Walt didn't speak for a moment. Then, yeah. Yeah, that'd be more than okay. When he hung up, the garage looked different. Brighter. Like the dust had lifted. He picked up his pencil again, hands still shaking, heart suddenly steady. And this time, when he drew, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. The whir of the 3D printer was low, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Walt had positioned it in the corner of the garage, next to the drill press and his grandfather's old wooden toolbox. The machine clicked and shifted, laying down the next layer of filament with mechanical precision, its head gliding smoothly across the build plate like a pen tracing the edge of a memory. It had taken him 3 full days to figure out how to use the thing, longer to troubleshoot the software, but now it felt like an extension of his hand. He sat nearby, watching the new wrist joint slowly take form, layer by careful layer. The design was his, based on the sketches from last week, but optimized through hours of research and a surprising email exchange with Grace Machinist 88. She turned out to be a retired aerospace engineer in Kansas who had lost her brother to a car accident years ago and had been quietly contributing to open-source medical tech forums ever since. Her response to his message had been warm, encouraging, and more helpful than he'd dared hope. She called his design clever, and he'd read that line over more than a dozen times. The joint was different now, more flexible, less mechanical. It would allow the prosthetic to rotate more naturally at the wrist, with tension cables replacing some of the stiff servo movements that had made the original prototype clumsy. Watching it print felt like watching an idea exhale. The sound of metal breathing. For the first time in years, Walt felt like he was building something that didn't just exist, it lived. Kyle was due in the next day. The idea of seeing his son again after all this time had stirred up a whirlpool inside him, nerves, regret, hope, fear, all swirling together. He had tried not to picture what the moment would be like, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, Kyle standing in the driveway, unsure whether to knock or just walk in. It had been over a decade since they'd spoken without some bitter edge in their voices. And now? Now, there was a possibility. That word again. Possibility. The machine chirped, signaling the print was complete. Walt stood slowly, knees cracking like knuckles, and removed the plate with practiced care. The part was warm, smooth, and nearly perfect. He held it in his hands and turned it over, admiring the clean geometry. "You'll do," he murmured. He spent the afternoon fitting the new piece into the prosthetic, replacing the old wrist mount and wiring in the rotation motor. It took longer than he expected, the socket had to be adjusted, the wiring rerouted, but he didn't mind. Every adjustment felt like a conversation with the machine. Every resistance was just a question waiting for an answer. When he finally powered it up and ran the test sequence, the wrist rotated with a satisfying hum, slow, steady, elegant. He watched it move, a sense of reverence blooming in his chest. It was like watching a sculpture stretch after centuries of stillness. That night, he didn't bother with frozen dinners or paper plates. He cooked a full meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, and set the table for two. He even used cloth napkins. The house smelled like warmth, like home. As he sat eating alone, he imagined Kyle sitting across from him. Older now. Maybe with gray in his beard. Maybe thinner, maybe heavier. Would his voice be deeper? Would it still carry that same impatient rhythm? Or had time softened him, too? Walt shook the thought away and focused on the bite in front of him. One thing at a time. After dinner, he went back to the garage. The prototype sat on the bench, looking almost human now. The fingers moved in near-perfect unison. The wrist turned fluidly. He'd even begun sketching ideas for sensory feedback using pressure sensors and an Arduino board he ordered online. It was all so far from where he started, so much closer to what he once imagined. He filmed another test run and posted it anonymously to the same forum where Grace Machinist 88 had helped him. He didn't say his name. Just called it Reclamation. Within an hour, the post had 24 comments. One called it a testament to old-school craftsmanship. Another wrote, "Looks like somebody still knows how to build with purpose." Walt read each reply slowly, savoring every word. For the first time in a long while, strangers weren't just seeing his work. They were seeing him. He slept lightly that night, waking at dawn and checking the driveway every 10 minutes until the sound of tires on gravel brought him to the front window. A silver hybrid pulled in slowly. The door opened. Kyle stepped out. He was older. Gray at the temples. Heavier in the chest, narrower in the face. His eyes scanned the yard, the porch, and finally the window, where Walt stood. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Kyle raised one hand in an awkward wave. Walt opened the door. They stood facing each other, years of silence piled up between them like bricks. "You look good," Walt said, voice gravelly. Kyle smiled faintly. "You look exactly the same." Walt laughed. It broke the tension. Just enough. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. They sat at the kitchen table. Coffee brewed. Kyle fidgeted with the napkin holder. Walt watched him like a father seeing his son for the first time. "I've been working on something," Walt said. Kyle nodded. "I figured. That hand in the video, it's more than that now." He stood, motioned toward the garage. "Want to see?" Kyle followed him in. The air smelled like oil and heat and plastic. When Kyle saw the bench, he stopped cold. "You built this?" "Every screw." Kyle stepped forward, leaned down, eyes wide. "This is incredible. Still needs work. Feedback loop isn't there yet. And the AI model's rudimentary. But it moves. It moves like it should." Kyle looked up at him. "You did this by yourself?" "Mostly. Internet helped. A few kind strangers." Kyle reached out and gently touched the prosthetic. "This could actually help someone." Walt nodded. "That's the idea." "Why now?" Kyle asked. The question wasn't hostile, just honest. Walt took a breath. "Because I stopped waiting for someone to tell me it was okay to matter again." Kyle didn't respond right away. But his eyes said enough. He understood. They spent the next few hours in the garage. Kyle asked questions, good ones. Technical ones. Walt answered each one, surprised at how easily the words came now. It was like music, their shared language returning from exile. By dusk, they were sketching ideas on the whiteboard and laughing at the worst ones. And when the sun went down, they sat on the back porch, 2 cups of coffee between them, the cicadas humming in the trees. "I missed this," Kyle said. Walt nodded. "Me too. I used to think you cared more about your machines than us." "I know. But now I see, maybe the machines were how you showed you cared." Walt looked at his son and saw not the boy who stormed out with a suitcase, but the man who came back with open hands. "I'm sorry I didn't say that sooner," Walt said. "I'm sorry I didn't ask sooner," Kyle replied. They sat in silence for a long time. Not awkward, just still. Like the world had finally exhaled. The prototype was still in the garage, resting on the bench. Tomorrow they'd test new joints. Maybe hook up a basic neural input system. Maybe even reach out to someone at Neuralink to ask real questions. Walt didn't know what would come of it. But tonight, he knew this, the metal hand he'd built had already done something miraculous. It had brought his son home. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and cooling metal as sunlight filtered through the garage windows in long, golden slashes. Walt stood over the workbench, coffee in hand, watching the prototype flex its fingers like a pianist warming up. Kyle sat nearby, sketchpad open, drawing up a new support brace concept they'd brainstormed the night before. It felt like they had slipped into an old rhythm that neither of them remembered learning but somehow knew by heart. Walt couldn't remember the last time he had felt this kind of purpose, not duty, not obligation, but purpose. It was something different. Something cleaner. At first, he worried Kyle was just humoring him, but those doubts had melted away with each question his son asked, each diagram they built together. There was no pretending in the way Kyle handled the circuits or tightened the screws. There was interest. Engagement. Maybe even pride. Kyle set his pencil down and leaned back. "We should consider using a carbon fiber base for the next version. Lighter. Stronger." Walt nodded, impressed. "You sure you didn't go into engineering after all?" Close. Industrial design. You never told me that. We weren't really talking then, remember? Walt grimaced slightly. Right. I guess I missed a lot. Kyle shrugged. We both did. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just fact. Walt glanced at the prototype again. We're going to need better servos if we want full articulation. The ones I have are dated. Let me make some calls, Kyle said, reaching for his phone. I still know a few people from school. They might be able to help. As Kyle stepped outside to make the call, Walt found himself staring at the space his son had just vacated. The garage felt different now, less like a shrine to the past, more like a launch pad for something new. He walked to the far end of the bench, where an old photo frame sat buried beneath a tarp. He pulled it out, wiped the dust from the glass. It was a picture of him and Judith, standing beside an early prototype of the hand, laughing, her arm hooked through his, pride shining on both their faces. He hadn't looked at it in years. She would have liked this, he said aloud, voice soft. Kyle returned a few minutes later. One of my friends is sending us a sample kit. Should be here in a couple days. Walt raised an eyebrow. That fast? She owes me. And she's curious. I showed her the video. What did she say? Said it looked like something out of Musk's early days. Raw. Ambitious. Brave. Walt chuckled. High praise. You earned it. They spent the rest of the morning making adjustments to the new wrist. The improved tension system was holding up well, but they needed to reinforce the base to handle the torque. They rigged a temporary solution using scrap aluminum and a few bolts from an old lawnmower handle. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. As they worked, Walt's hands started to shake again. Not just the faint tremor from before, but a real, visible quake, his grip slipping on the screwdriver. He cursed under his breath and set the tool down, flexing his fingers, trying to will the motion away. Kyle noticed. You okay? Yeah, Walt said too quickly. Just tired. Kyle didn't press. But Walt saw the concern in his eyes. That evening, after Kyle had gone to bed in the guest room, Walt sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at his hand. It wasn't just fatigue. The tremor was getting worse. The doctor had warned him months ago, but he'd ignored it. Neuropathy can be managed, but there's no reversing it, she had said. You need to prepare for long-term decline. He'd nodded, smiled politely, and thrown the pamphlet in the trash. But now, with the project so close to real potential, and Kyle back in his life, his own body was threatening to betray him. He looked down at the hand again. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was building strength in metal while losing it in flesh. The next morning, he did something he hadn't done in years. He called his doctor. Booked an appointment. No delay. No excuses. Just a quiet decision made in the half-light of resolve. Kyle noticed something different in his father's energy when he came down to the garage later. You all right? He asked again. Yeah, Walt said with more truth this time. I've got a checkup tomorrow. Figured it was time. Kyle smiled faintly. That's good, Dad. They worked for a few more hours on testing the response delay in the hand's grip strength. It was off by a fraction of a second, enough to matter. Walt suspected it was a software bottleneck. You ever mess around with neural nets? He asked. A little. In school. Why? Thinking we could run a lightweight model for pressure responsiveness. Train it on grasp types, soft, firm, resistant. We'd need data sets. We can build our own. Start small. Kyle grinned. Look at you. AI talk. Walt laughed. I pick things up. Apparently so. They dove into the software side that afternoon, setting up a simple interface to record pressure data and response delay. Kyle suggested they test with fruit, an apple, a grape, a banana. Measure crush versus grip. Walt joked, and maybe a beer can, for old time's sake. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Only if it's empty. They were laughing more now. The air in the garage had changed, loosened. Where once there was dust and silence, now there was light and movement and the quiet hum of potential. As they wrapped up for the night, Kyle lingered at the door. I was thinking, once we get the model stable, maybe we submit it somewhere. For real. A grant. Or a lab test. Walt didn't speak at first. He just looked at his son, really looked at him. You think they'd even look at us? Maybe not. But we submit anyway. Just like you did all those years ago. Walt blinked. That letter, the VA rejection, had haunted him. But now. Maybe it didn't have to be the end of the story. All right, he said. Let's give M something to talk about. Kyle clapped him on the back and headed upstairs. Walt lingered in the garage a little longer, walking slowly past the shelves of old tools, the jars of bolts, the sketches pinned to the wall. He stopped at the prototype one last time before bed. The fingers were still. The metal cold. But when he pressed the power switch and saw the soft blue light flicker to life, he imagined something else, a future he could still shape. Not despite his age, but because of it. Because he had seen the failures, the rejections, the dust, and the rust, and had chosen, every day now, to reboot. Not just the machine. But himself. The waiting room smelled like lemon-scented floor polish and quiet resignation. Pale blue walls. Magazine 6 months out of date. A TV in the corner played some daytime health segment at half volume, featuring a too-happy host talking about blood sugar. Walt sat in a chair that creaked under his weight every time he shifted. He hated this place, not because of the staff or the care, but because of what it symbolized. Sitting here made him feel like he'd already crossed into some holding pattern between relevance and obsolescence. He adjusted his jacket and stared at the same water stain on the ceiling he'd noticed the last time he was here. Kyle had offered to come with him, but Walt declined. Some things a man needed to face alone. Especially this. His name was finally called by a nurse with kind eyes and a tablet in her hands. She led him through a maze of pastel-colored halls to a small exam room, where the smell of antiseptic hit a little harder. Dr. Patel will be in shortly, she said with a smile before closing the door. Walt sat on the paper-covered exam table, the crinkling noise loud in the sterile silence. The seconds dragged. Then the door opened, and in walked Dr. Neha Patel, mid-40s, sharp eyes, always with the calm energy of someone used to delivering hard news. Good to see you again, Mr. Harris, she said, pulling up a rolling stool and sitting across from him. It's been, 11 months? Sounds about right, he replied. I figured it was time. She opened her laptop. You mentioned some changes in your hand tremors when you called. Walt nodded and held out his right hand. The tremor was faint, but persistent. Dr. Patel watched carefully. That's more pronounced than last year. Yeah. And not just the hand. I've had some balance issues. Slow mornings. My grip's not what it used to be. And the numbness in your feet? Still there. Worse when I wake up. She nodded, typing as he spoke. Well, based on what you're describing, and your last set of labs, I'd say we're looking at progressive peripheral neuropathy, possibly exacerbated by small vessel disease. The tremors could be early signs of Parkinsonism, but I'd need to refer you to a neurologist for confirmation. Walt took the words like cold water on the face. Not unexpected. But still sharp. So what does that mean? It means you're going to need to start planning around limitations. Physical therapy. Occupational support. Medication to manage the symptoms, but we can't reverse the progression. Not yet, anyway. She paused. Have you considered making adaptations at home? Railings, balance aids, a modified vehicle. Walt shook his head. I still work in my garage. I've got a project. Something big. I'm not ready for railings yet. She smiled gently. I'm not saying stop. I'm saying plan. Your project sounds important. Let's make sure you can keep doing it safely. What if I don't want to slow down? Then don't, she said, voice steady. But accept help. That's not weakness. That's smart. He let that sit for a moment. Then finally asked, how much time before this really starts affecting what I can do? It varies. Maybe a year. Maybe 5. Maybe longer if you stay active, eat well, and follow through with care. She reached into a drawer and handed him a pamphlet. I know you hate these. But keep it. Look it over when you're ready. He took it without looking. Parkinson's disease and you. White letters on a blue background. Thanks, document. She stood. You're not alone in this, Walt. I'll refer you to neurology. In the meantime, don't stop building. Just be ready for what's next. He nodded and stood, slower than usual. As he left the office, the hallway seemed longer. The floor more uneven. He walked past the receptionist with a smile he didn't mean and stepped out into the bright morning sun, blinking against the light. The parking lot was mostly empty. His truck sat where he left it, a few oil stains beneath it like aging footprints. He sat inside with the door open for a moment, the wind ruffling the paper on the passenger seat. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just sat there, letting the truth settle in. He was running out of time. But he wasn't out yet. That afternoon, he returned to the garage. Kyle was tinkering with the AI model on the laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. How'd it go? He asked without looking up. Walt set the pamphlet on the bench. It went. Kyle glanced at the cover. His jaw tightened. That bad? It's not terminal. Just progressive. I've got some time. But not forever. Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then we don't waste it. Walt smiled. That's the plan. They worked into the evening. The new servo arrived in the mail, thanks to Kyle's friend, and they installed it with surprising ease. The response time improved by nearly half a second. The hand now gripped and released with the kind of control that could be used in the real world. Walt imagined someone using it to button a shirt. To tie a child's shoelace. To write again. He sent the latest demo to the forum, again under his anonymous handle. This time, the post exploded. Within a few hours, it had over 200 comments. Engineers, therapists, even a few veterans chimed in. One comment stood out, where can we see more? This could change lives. Walt stared at the screen. Change lives. He never thought he'd get to do that again. Not at his age. Not with a diagnosis shadowing his every step. But here it was. The next morning, Kyle brought down a small envelope. From the lab at Stanford, he said. That fast? Apparently someone from the forum forwarded your video. They want to talk. Walt opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a printed letter, simple and direct. We would like to invite you to present your project at the Neural Interfaces Summit this fall. Your design represents a rare convergence of practical experience and emerging tech. We believe your work could play a role in the future of prosthetics. Please contact us to discuss travel and logistics. Walt read it twice, then again. His hands trembled, but not from the illness. From disbelief. Kyle grinned. I think you just got drafted. I haven't even finished the prototype. That's the beauty of it, Dad. It's not done yet. Neither are you. Walt folded the letter carefully and set it down beside the prototype. The future had just walked through his door, without warning, without permission. And somehow, after all this time, he was ready. Not because the diagnosis didn't scare him. It did. But fear wasn't the same thing as surrender. He looked down at the hand, his creation, his second chance, and then at his own. One made of metal. The other of aging skin. Both still reaching. Still trying. Still alive. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The letter sat on the kitchen table like it had grown roots. Walt had read it so many times he could recite it from memory, but he still didn't quite believe it was real. Stanford. Neural Interfaces Summit. An invitation to speak, not just attend. They wanted to hear from him. A 71-year-old former machinist with nerve damage and a shaky past. It was absurd. And yet, the postmark didn't lie. The return address was real. Kyle hovered near the fridge, coffee in hand, watching his father quietly. "You going to reply?" he asked. Walt stared at the envelope. "I don't know yet. Dad, this could be huge. You've been waiting your whole life for someone to really see your work." "Yeah, but they're expecting someone else. Someone younger. Someone with credentials." "No. They're expecting the guy who built something that works when all the experts just talked." Walt didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for the prototype on the counter, turning it slowly in his hands. It really was good. Solid. Functional. Even elegant, in a rough, industrial way. The design hadn't come from textbooks. It had come from decades of building, breaking, fixing, and rebuilding. From watching failure and learning what it was trying to teach. But none of that felt like it belonged in a room full of PhDs and TED Talk alumni. "They'll eat me alive," Walt muttered. "They'll think I'm just a fluke. A lucky old man with a garage." Kyle set his mug down with more force than necessary. "You know what your problem is? You still think you need permission." Walt raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? You keep waiting for someone to tell you you're allowed to matter again. That it's okay to show up. To be bold. But no one's coming, Dad. No one's ever coming. If Elon Musk waited for someone to give him the green light, he'd still be in South Africa selling candy bars door to door. You either show up, or you get left behind." The room went still. Not angry. Just quiet. Walt stared at his son, this man who'd once slammed the door on their relationship and now stood defending his father's place in the world like it was sacred. "You believe in this that much?" Walt asked. "I believe in you," Kyle said. And for a moment, neither of them could speak. Later that night, Walt sat in the garage, the prototype lit by a single overhead bulb. He pulled out his old notebook, the one he hadn't touched since the week Judith died, and began drafting what he would say if he did go. No slides. No jargon. Just the story. His story. A man who got tired of being invisible and built something real. Something that moved. Something that reached. The next morning, he typed up the reply. It was short, to the point: "Thank you for the invitation. I would be honored to speak. Please let me know the next steps." He signed it, Walter Harris, then paused before adding a line he hadn't used in years: machinist. Veteran. Builder. He hit send and felt the weight leave his chest, replaced by something lighter. Not quite confidence, but close. Hope, maybe. Possibility. The next few weeks were a blur. They upgraded the prototype again, this time integrating the basic AI grip memory Kyle had been coding. It wasn't perfect, but it could learn from repetition: soft squeeze, firm hold, delicate release. They tested it on everything: grapes, plastic utensils, even a raw egg. The egg cracked on the first try. The second time, it held. "That's machine learning," Kyle said with a grin. Walt chuckled. "That's black magic." A package arrived from Stanford with travel details and a speaker schedule. Walt was scheduled to close the first day of the summit, a coveted spot. "They're calling it the Outlier Session," Kyle said, reading the schedule. "A showcase for unconventional innovators." "So I'm the Curiosity Act," Walt said with a smirk. "No, Dad. You're the finale." As the date drew closer, Walt started recording practice sessions. He stood in the garage, in front of a makeshift podium Kyle had built from scrap wood, and rehearsed his story. The VA rejection, the years lost to grief and guilt, the first spark of interest after hearing Elon Musk talk about human-machine integration and the future of cognition. He recited the part about feeling too old to start, and the moment he stopped asking permission. Each time he spoke it aloud, the story felt more real. More powerful. By the fourth practice run, Walt didn't need the notes. He just talked. The night before the flight, he and Kyle sat in the living room, prototype packed safely in a foam-padded case. "You ready?" Kyle asked. Walt exhaled slowly. "As I'll ever be." "You're going to crush it. I just don't want to fall off the stage." Kyle smiled. "You fall, you get up. Like always." The flight to California was smooth, though Walt winced at every turbulence bump. His legs stiffened after an hour, and the tremor in his hand reminded him he wasn't 25 anymore. But he made it. At the hotel, he was met by a young coordinator from the summit, bright-eyed, energetic, probably fresh out of college. She introduced herself as Mel. "We're so excited you're here, Mr. Harris," she said as she handed him his badge. "Your video blew up on our Slack channel. Everyone's been talking about it." "That right?" he asked, adjusting his cap. "I didn't realize old men in garages were so trendy these days." She laughed. "You'd be surprised. The best ideas often come from the least expected places." The next day, Walt wandered the exhibition hall. Booths lined with sleek robots, neural interface headbands, virtual reality rehabilitation tools. It was dazzling. Intimidating. He watched a 20-something MIT grad demo a limb control interface powered by eye movement, then a teen from Tokyo present a full spinal stimulation rig that helped paraplegics regain some motion. It was all brilliant. Cutting edge. And yet, when people stopped by Walt's modest table to see the hand, something shifted. They didn't just nod politely, they leaned in. They asked questions. Real ones. "How'd you get the motion so smooth? What's the pressure range? You said you used garage tools. And you're 71. He answered them all. Calmly. Proudly. By the time his talk rolled around, he wasn't nervous anymore. He was ready. The auditorium wasn't massive, maybe 200 people, but the lights made it feel like a stadium. He stepped onto the stage, hands steady for once, and stood behind the podium. The prototype was displayed beside him, powered up and glowing faintly. He looked at the crowd and opened with a simple question. What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Heads tilted. Pens paused. The room quieted. Walt took a breath. My name is Walt Harris. I'm 71. And for a long time, I believed that age meant the end of invention. That once the world stops asking for your input, you stop offering it. I believed I'd missed my chance. Until I realized, no one was ever going to give me permission to matter again. I had to give that to myself. For the next 15 minutes, he told his story. The lost years. The grief. The spark from a podcast quote, Elon Musk talking about how the brain and machines were destined to merge. I didn't understand all the science, Walt said. But I understood the feeling, of not being done yet. He talked about the garage, the forums, the hand. He showed the videos. The egg test. The soft grasp. The learning curve. And when he finished, he looked out at the crowd and said the one thing he hoped would stay with them: don't measure potential by youth. Measure it by willingness. Because I may be old, but I'm just getting started. Silence. Then a wave of applause. Not polite. Not obligatory. Real. Long, loud. Kyle was in the back row, clapping with wet eyes. Mel gave him a standing ovation. A tech CEO too rose up, wiped his glasses. Walt stepped off stage to a line of people waiting to talk to him. Not just students or fans, but investors, researchers, veterans. One man in a Neuralink badge leaned in and whispered, "You ever think about integrating feedback channels into the sensory cortex? We should talk." Walt smiled. Let's. He'd come to return something, to offer the world the best of what he still had. And what he found was that the world was still ready to receive it. The airport felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Walt wheeled his suitcase slowly through the terminal, the prototype case strapped carefully to the top. The fluorescent lights hummed above, and the chatter of travelers mingled with distant announcements. Outside, the California sun was warm but forgiving, the sky a pale blue that promised something new. Kyle walked beside him, steady and encouraging, but Walt's mind was elsewhere, replaying the last few days at the summit like a vivid movie. Faces, voices, the weight of hands shaking his own. A young researcher had called him inspirational, a word Walt wasn't used to hearing without sarcasm. He found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he still had something to offer this fast-moving world. As they boarded the plane back to Ohio, Walt gazed out the window, watching the ground shrink beneath them. It was a strange feeling. Leaving behind the whirlwind of conferences, tech demos, and hopeful conversations. But it wasn't goodbye. It was more like a brief pause between chapters. Back home, the familiar creak of the garage door was like a balm. The scent of oil, metal, and sawdust wrapped around him, grounding him in what he'd built and what he still wanted to build. Kyle unpacked the suitcase carefully, setting the prototype on the bench like a trophy and a promise. "You're really going to keep it this?" Kyle asked, watching his father's eyes light up as he adjusted a tiny servo. "I'm not done," Walt said simply. "I never was." Over the next few weeks, the summit's ripple effect became clear. Emails flooded Walt's inbox, from curious engineers, potential partners, even a few journalists interested in telling his story. He had always been a private man, but something about this felt right. The world needed to hear that age wasn't the end of invention, it was just a different kind of beginning. One morning, Walt sat with a cup of coffee and a new message flagged at the top: invitation to collaborate on a Neuralink prosthetics project. Potential funding available. The sender was a lead scientist who had worked with Elon Musk's team. Walt blinked. For a moment, it felt like a dream too wild to be true. But the details were real: dates, contacts, objectives. This was the next step. A chance to take his work beyond the garage and into a place where science fiction blurred with reality. Kyle grinned. "Looks like the universe is giving you a second shot." Walt stared out the window at the fading autumn leaves, letting the gravity of it settle. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving something to himself, that no matter how many years passed, the capacity to create, to change, to connect, never truly died. He thought back to Elon Musk's words. The fearlessness, the refusal to accept limits imposed by age or circumstance. Musk had once said, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Walt had lived his life in the shadows of those odds. Now, he was stepping into the light. His days became a delicate balance of rehab exercises, prototype improvements, and preparing for the upcoming collaboration. His hands trembled more some mornings, but he learned to adjust. To ask for help when he needed it. To celebrate small victories. One afternoon, as he worked on integrating new sensors into the prototype, the phone rang. It was Mel, the summit coordinator. "Walt, we just got clearance. The Neuralink project wants to fast-track your onboarding. They're impressed with your practical insights and want to get you in the lab ASAP." Walt swallowed hard. "I'm not sure I'm ready." "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you. That's why they want you." The word sank in deeper than any praise. It wasn't about perfection or youth. It was about authenticity and courage. Over the next few days, Walt prepared for the journey to the Neuralink facility. The travel was exhausting, but the moment he stepped into the lab, he felt a surge of energy he hadn't experienced in years. Bright screens, humming machines, a team buzzing with ideas and breakthroughs. The lead scientist greeted him warmly. "Walt, welcome. We've read your work, watched your demos, and we're excited to see what you bring to the table." Walt nodded, heart pounding. They showed him the current projects: prosthetics with neural feedback loops, brain-machine interfaces designed to restore lost function, experimental devices still on the edge of possibility. It was intimidating. But also exhilarating. One day, Walt found himself in a quiet corner of the lab, tinkering with his prototype alongside younger engineers who marveled at his hands-on knowledge. He realized then that experience wasn't something that faded with age, it was a foundation for innovation. And that foundation was rare. During breaks, Walt would pull up videos of Elon Musk's talks, studying the way Musk approached problems with relentless curiosity and an unwillingness to accept no as an answer. He felt a kinship, not with the billionaire persona, but with the mindset. The drive to push boundaries, to rewrite what's possible. Weeks turned into months. Walt's prototype evolved, incorporating neural sensors that allowed the hand to interpret signals directly from the nervous system. Tests showed promising results, patients reported a new level of control and sensation. Walt's contributions were acknowledged in research papers and presentations. But more importantly, he was rediscovering purpose. The isolation that had shadowed his later years was lifting. He was connected, to people, to a mission, to the future. One evening, after a long day of trials, Walt sat in the lab's break room, scrolling through messages from the online community that had supported him. Comments from veterans, people with disabilities, caregivers, all thanking him for sharing his journey. He thought about his own lost years, the regrets and the silence. And then he realized something profound: the story wasn't about the past. It was about what he was still building. About the lives he could touch, the barriers he could help break down. The old Walt, the man weighed down by grief and fear, was still there. But he had been joined by someone new. A creator unafraid to take risks, to fail, and to try again. As the sun set outside the lab's windows, casting long shadows across the room, Walt smiled. He wasn't just an old man tinkering in a garage anymore. He was part of something bigger. A movement toward a future where age was not a limit, but a lens, a way to see the world with clarity, resilience, and hope. And he was ready to keep moving forward. Walt woke early to the soft hum of the city outside his hotel window. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long streaks across the room, painting it with promise. Today was no ordinary day. It was the day he would meet Elon Musk in person. After months of remote collaboration, emails, and phone calls, the moment had finally arrived. Walt dressed carefully, choosing a simple shirt and jacket, the kind he imagined Musk would respect: honest, straightforward, no pretense. The journey to the SpaceX headquarters was surreal. As the car weaved through the sprawling campus, Walt felt his heart race. He had imagined this moment for years but had never dared believe it could become real. At the visitor's entrance, a young assistant greeted him with a warm smile and led him through sleek halls lined with photos of rockets and electric cars. Then, in a glass-walled conference room, he saw him, Elon Musk, leaning casually against the table, eyes bright with curiosity and a hint of challenge. "Walt, it's great to finally meet you," Musk said, extending his hand. The grip was firm, steady, a handshake from someone who understood the weight of risk and the thrill of innovation. "Likewise," Walt replied, voice steady despite the flutter in his chest. They sat down, and Musk wasted no time. "I've been following your work. The hand prototype is impressive, especially given your background and the hurdles you've faced. How are you feeling about where we can take this?" Walt took a breath, recalling the journey from the lonely garage to this very room. "Honestly, I never thought I'd be here. But I believe this technology can change lives, especially for people who feel like they've been left behind. Age, injury, disability, it doesn't have to be the end of the story." Musk nodded, leaning forward. "That's exactly the mindset we need. The future belongs to those who don't accept limits. Neuralink is about breaking down barriers, between human and machine, between past and future." Walt smiled. "I've learned that sometimes the biggest barriers are in our own minds. We get stuck thinking we're too old, too slow, too broken. But that's a lie." Their conversation deepened, touching on the technical challenges, the ethical questions, and the social implications of brain-machine interfaces. Musk shared his vision of a future where humans could augment their cognition, restore lost functions, and perhaps even communicate directly through thought. Walt listened, absorbing every word, but also offering practical insights from years of hands-on experience. "You know," Walt said, "when I was younger, I thought invention was about big labs and fancy degrees. But it's really about persistence and willingness to learn. And about knowing the people who will actually use the technology." Musk smiled, impressed. "That's why you're valuable to us. You bring the human element." Over the following weeks, Walt's involvement grew. He collaborated with Neuralink engineers, offering feedback and suggestions that helped refine prototypes. They tested new sensory feedback systems, improving the realism of touch and pressure. Walt's presence bridged a crucial gap between cutting-edge science and real-world application. Outside the lab, Walt faced his own internal challenges. His body reminded him of its limits, a tremor here, a twinge there. But his spirit grew stronger. The skepticism from some family members faded as they saw him thrive in ways they hadn't expected. Kyle became his steadfast supporter, attending meetings, learning alongside his father, and even contributing code. One evening, as they walked through a nearby park, Kyle stopped and looked at Walt with quiet admiration. "You've changed everything, Dad. Not just for yourself, but for a lot of people." Walt nodded slowly, eyes tracing the amber leaves falling around them. "I'm just getting started." At a conference organized by Neuralink, Walt was invited to share the stage alongside Musk and other leading scientists. The auditorium was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. When Walt stepped up to speak, the applause was genuine, an acknowledgement of both his journey and his contributions. "I want to tell you a story," Walt began. "About a man who thought he was too old to matter. About a moment when he decided to stop waiting for permission and start building. And about the future, a future where none of us are left behind." The crowd listened, rapt, as he described the evolution of his prototype, the power of belief, and the promise of human-machine collaboration. Musk joined him on stage, adding, "Walt reminds us all that innovation isn't just for the young. It's for anyone brave enough to challenge their limits." After the event, Walt received messages from veterans, seniors, and people with disabilities who saw themselves in his story. They thanked him for showing that it was never too late to dream, to create, to connect. Late one night, as Walt prepared for bed, he found a video message from Elon Musk in his inbox. Musk spoke directly to him, words infused with encouragement and vision. "Keep pushing the boundaries, Walt. The future is ours to shape, no matter our age." Walt watched the video, feeling a profound sense of belonging. He wasn't just part of a project, he was part of a movement. And that movement was bigger than any one person. It was about humanity's collective journey toward a new frontier. As the weeks passed, Walt balanced the demands of the lab with moments of quiet reflection. He thought about Judith, the years lost to sorrow, the regrets that had once weighed him down. But now, those shadows felt distant. He had found a new purpose. A new legacy. One built not on what was lost, but on what was still possible. One morning, as he adjusted the sensors on his prototype, Kyle called from the other room. "Dad, you've got a video call." "It's Elon." Walt's heart leapt. "On my way." The call connected, and Musk's face appeared, smiling broadly. "Walt, we want you to lead a new initiative, focused on integrating Neuralink technology with assistive devices for seniors and people with disabilities. Your experience is exactly what we need." Walt swallowed hard, overwhelmed and honored. "I'd be proud to." As the call ended, Walt leaned back, feeling the weight and wonder of what was happening. The journey that had seemed impossible was unfolding in ways he'd never imagined. He was no longer an old man watching from the sidelines. He was a pioneer, bridging the gap between yesterday's dreams and tomorrow's reality. Outside the window, the city shimmered with possibilities. And Walt knew, this was only the beginning. Walt sat in his workshop, the quiet hum of the evening settling around him like a comforting blanket. The prototype hand rested on the workbench, its tiny circuits gleaming under the soft light. Tonight, the room felt different, charged, alive with possibility. He thought back to the first time he held that battered wrench, the frustration, the fear, and then the spark, a spark that had never truly died, just waited patiently beneath years of doubt and regret. The collaboration with Neuralink had opened doors he never dreamed existed, but tonight, it was time to look inward. To rekindle that fire that had fueled his entire life. The question lingered, how do you reignite a spark when you feel the world has moved on? Walt's fingers traced the edges of the prototype, feeling the warmth of the components, the promise they held. He remembered Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Those words echoed in his mind, stronger than ever. He pulled out a notebook, the pages filled with sketches, ideas, and notes from the past months. Ideas for improving the sensory feedback system, concepts for integrating AI to predict user intent, and a dream, a vision of a device that could restore not just function but dignity to those who felt forgotten. As the clock ticked past midnight, Walt scribbled furiously, the old habit of problem-solving sparking back to life. Each idea seemed to breathe new energy into him. The night wasn't just about work, it was about reclaiming a part of himself he'd thought lost forever. The next morning, Walt woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He called Kyle, eager to share his breakthrough concept, a modular neural interface that could adapt to different users' needs, making the technology accessible to a broader range of people. Kyle's voice crackled with excitement over the phone. "Dad, that's brilliant. This could be a game-changer for the project." Energized, they spent hours discussing design, feasibility, and next steps. Their collaboration felt effortless, a blend of experience and fresh perspective. But Walt knew the real test would come in the lab, with real users and real challenges. Over the following weeks, Walt dove deeper into prototyping. His hands, though slower than they once were, worked with precision born from decades of practice. He assembled delicate circuits, programmed new algorithms, and tested sensors with meticulous care. Each small success fueled the next. The team at Neuralink watched with admiration, inspired by Walt's relentless drive. His age was no barrier, it was an asset, bringing wisdom and patience to a fast-paced environment. One afternoon, during a trial session with a volunteer participant, a retired veteran with limited hand mobility, Walt observed intently as the modular interface responded to neural signals. The participant smiled for the first time in years, his fingers moving with newfound grace. "This is incredible," the lead engineer whispered. Walt's eyes moistened. This was more than technology, it was hope. Outside the lab, Walt's story began to ripple through communities of seniors, caregivers, and advocates. Interviews, podcasts, and social media posts shared his journey, an old man defying odds, reigniting a spark that many thought had burned out. Messages poured in. "You give me hope, I'm going to try again, it's never too late." Walt kept each message close, a reminder of why he refused to stop. Yet, amidst the momentum, doubts crept in. Some days, the tremors in his hands grew worse, frustration mounting. Skeptical voices from his past whispered, questioning whether he was chasing a dream too far gone. But then he remembered a phrase from Elon Musk: "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." That became Walt's mantra. On a quiet evening, he stood by the window, looking out at the stars glittering against the dark canvas of the night sky. He thought about the universe, vast, mysterious, full of untapped potential. Like the stars, his own potential hadn't dimmed, it had merely been waiting to be noticed again. The next big milestone was approaching, the annual Neuralink demonstration where new breakthroughs were showcased. Walt's team had prepared the modular interface for public testing, an event that could change public perception and accelerate funding. The pressure was immense. In the days leading up to the demo, Walt rehearsed, tested, and refined. His body tired easily, but his mind stayed sharp, fueled by the stakes and the promise. The demo day arrived. The auditorium was packed with investors, scientists, journalists, and curious onlookers. Walt took the stage alongside Elon Musk and fellow engineers. The air buzzed with anticipation. Walt introduced the modular neural interface, explaining its design philosophy and potential impact. Then came the moment of truth. A volunteer, a woman in her late 60s who had lost partial hand function after a stroke, stepped forward. As the interface synced with her neural signals, she moved her fingers tentatively, then with growing confidence. Gasps and applause filled the room as she gripped and released a small ball, the motion smooth and natural. Walt's heart soared. After the demonstration, he found himself surrounded by people eager to learn, collaborate, and support. The media spotlight shone brightly, but Walt stayed grounded, focused on the work ahead. That night, as he reflected on the day's triumph, he realized that the spark he had reignited was no longer fragile. It had become a flame, illuminating not just his path but the way for many others. He was proof that age, challenge, and doubt were not barriers, they were catalysts. A catalyst to dream harder, fight longer, and create with purpose. The journey wasn't over. It was evolving. And Walt was ready to lead it, one bold step at a time. Walt sat in the small conference room at Neuralink, the hum of computers and soft voices filling the background like a steady heartbeat. Today was different. Today, he was about to meet a group of seniors, people who, like him, had faced the creeping shadows of aging, disability, and doubt. They weren't engineers or scientists. They were everyday heroes, individuals who had been told the world was moving too fast, that they were left behind. The irony was not lost on Walt. Years ago, he had been one of them, tired, forgotten, afraid. But today, he held something more than hope, he held a promise. The modular neural interface prototype sat on the table, sleek and unassuming. For some, it was a piece of technology. For others, a bridge. The room filled slowly as the seniors arrived, some with canes, some with wheelchairs, all with stories etched in their faces. Walt greeted each person warmly, sensing the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in the air. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know it's not always easy to try something new, especially when you've been told it's too late. But today, we want to show you what's possible." The demonstrations began. Volunteers tried the interface, their neural signals connecting with the device to move robotic limbs or control computers with thought. Some faces lit up with wonder, others were cautious, uncertain. Walt watched closely, answering questions, explaining how the technology could restore independence and dignity. In one corner, an elderly woman named Mary, who had lost mobility after a stroke, tentatively placed her hand on the device. After a few moments of adjustment, a smile broke across her face as her fingers moved. Tears welled in Walt's eyes. This was why he had fought so hard. "It's never too late," he said softly to the group. "Our minds and hearts can still create, connect, and evolve." The session ended with heartfelt conversations, connections forged between strangers united by a shared hope. Afterward, Walt stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, the golden leaves swirling around him like memories in motion. Kyle joined him, sensing the emotional weight of the day. "They need this, Dad. More than they realize." Walt nodded. "And we need to keep listening. Technology without empathy is just machines." Over the following weeks, Walt and the team worked to refine the interface based on feedback from the seniors. They simplified the setup, improved comfort, and ensured the system could adapt to different cognitive and physical abilities. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was about crossing the divide between innovation and accessibility, between hope and reality. Walt found himself visiting community centers, senior living facilities, and support groups. He shared his story, listened to others, and witnessed the quiet strength that often went unnoticed. The resistance wasn't always from technology, it was from fear. Fear of change, failure, and irrelevance. Walt understood. He had been there. One evening, after a particularly moving visit, he sat alone in his workshop, pondering the divide that technology had to cross to truly serve humanity. The glow of the prototype on the bench seemed to pulse with possibility. Suddenly, an idea sparked: what if they could develop a mentorship program? Pair seniors interested in learning the technology with younger engineers eager to listen and teach. A way to build bridges, not just devices. He shared the idea with Kyle, who immediately took to it, drafting plans and reaching out to local organizations. The mentorship program launched with modest beginnings, just a handful of participants meeting weekly in community spaces. But the impact was profound. Seniors gained confidence and skills, young engineers learned empathy and perspective. One afternoon, during a mentorship session, Mary, the same woman who had moved her fingers with the interface, shared a story with her mentee. "I was told I'd never do this again," she said, eyes shining. "But here I am, proving them wrong." Her mentee smiled, inspired by her resilience. News of the program spread, attracting attention from media and policymakers. Walt was invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of technology, aging, and human connection. Each talk was a reminder that progress wasn't just about gadgets and algorithms, it was about people. Meanwhile, Walt's health continued to challenge him. Some days, the tremors worsened, and fatigue threatened to slow his momentum. But he refused to let those moments define him. Instead, he leaned into the community he had helped build, drawing strength from shared stories and collective hope. One chilly evening, Walt received a message from Elon Musk, a simple note: "Keep crossing divides. The future is closer than it seems." Those words stayed with him as he prepared for a visit from Judith, his daughter, whom he hadn't seen in years. The decision to reconnect had been difficult, filled with uncertainty and old wounds. But Walt knew that crossing divides wasn't just about technology, it was about healing relationships, bridging gaps in family and heart. When Judith arrived, the initial meeting was awkward, filled with silence and tentative smiles. Yet as they talked, shared memories, and confronted past pain, a new understanding began to form. Judith listened to Walt's journey, the challenges and triumphs, and saw her father in a new light, not just as a man defined by age or loss, but as a pioneer of hope. Over time, their visits became more frequent, conversations deeper. Walt realized that rebuilding trust required patience and vulnerability, qualities he had learned through his work and his own transformation. As the seasons changed, Walt stood once more in the workshop, surrounded by prototypes, notes, and memories. The journey was far from over, but the divides were shrinking. Between generations, between technology and humanity, between fear and possibility. Walt smiled, knowing that crossing these divides was the true frontier. And he was ready to keep going. Walt stood at the threshold of the Neuralink lab, heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and quiet resolve. Years of effort, countless late nights, and the steady climb through doubt and setbacks had led him to this moment. The breakthrough they had dreamed of was within reach. In the days leading up to this, Walt had barely slept. Every test, every iteration, every failure and small success had built toward today's critical trial, a real-time neural interface that could restore complex motor functions and sensory feedback in a way no one had thought possible before. The stakes were high, the promise immense. The team gathered around the testing room, the air thick with expectation. Elon Musk stood nearby, calm but focused, his presence a steady reminder of the vision that had set this all in motion. The volunteer was a woman named Gloria, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s who had lost partial use of her left arm after a stroke. She had volunteered for this trial not because she expected miracles, but because she believed in possibility, and in Walt. As Gloria was connected to the Neuralink device, Walt's gaze never wavered. The prototype sensors linked with her brain's neural pathways, translating thought into command and feedback into sensation. For minutes, nothing happened. The room held its breath, every eye fixed on the monitors. Then, slowly, Gloria's fingers twitched. A small, tentative motion, but it was a start. The crowd exhaled quietly, sensing the fragile birth of something extraordinary. Encouraged, Gloria concentrated harder. The prototype responded, guiding her hand through increasingly complex movements, grasping a cup, feeling its texture, lifting it to her lips. Tears streamed down her face as she experienced what many had thought lost forever: touch, control, independence. Walt's own eyes misted. This was more than a technical achievement. It was a reclamation of self, a restoration of dignity and hope. Elon stepped forward, addressing the room. This moment shows what's possible when we refuse to accept limits, of the body, of age, of expectation. Neuralink is not just about technology, it's about rewriting the narrative of what it means to grow older, to face challenge, to evolve. After the demonstration, the lab buzzed with celebration tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The device still needed refinement, and broader accessibility remained a challenge. But for Walt, the breakthrough was a profound validation of every step he had taken, every risk he had dared to face. As the excitement settled, Walt found a quiet moment with Gloria. She grasped his hand firmly. "You've given me a new chance," she said, voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you." Walt smiled, feeling the depth of that connection. Outside the lab, news of the breakthrough spread rapidly. Headlines celebrated the fusion of human resilience and cutting-edge technology. Walt became a symbol not just of innovation but of perseverance and possibility at any age. But with attention came pressure, expectations, questions, even skepticism. Could this technology truly transform lives on a broad scale? Would society embrace it? Walt met these challenges head-on, using every platform to share honest stories and emphasize empathy over hype. Meanwhile, his collaboration with Elon deepened. Musk's restless energy pushed Walt to think bigger, to envision a future where Neuralink wasn't just a tool for healing but a bridge to enhanced cognition, communication, and even creativity. Walt embraced this vision, yet grounded it in the human experience he knew intimately. He continued working with communities often overlooked in tech: seniors, veterans, people with disabilities, ensuring their voices shaped the future. One evening, as Walt reviewed data and adjusted algorithms, a thought struck him: the next frontier wasn't just technology or biology, it was connection. Between people, between minds, between generations. He shared this insight with Elon, who immediately saw its potential. Together, they brainstormed new projects focused on social integration, cognitive enhancement, and even collaborative learning through Neuralink. But Walt also knew balance was essential. The rapid pace of innovation risked leaving behind those unable or unwilling to adapt quickly. To address this, Walt spearheaded educational initiatives, workshops, and support networks designed to ease transitions and foster inclusivity. He believed deeply that technology should empower all, not just a privileged few. The months that followed were some of the most intense and rewarding of Walt's life. He traveled widely, speaking at conferences, meeting with policymakers, and engaging directly with users. Each interaction reinforced his conviction that the human spirit, resilient, curious, and determined, was the true driver of progress. At home, relationships mended and grew stronger. Judith and Kyle became pillars of support, sharing in the highs and lows with unwavering love. One afternoon, while sitting together in the workshop, Kyle looked up from his laptop. "Dad, you've changed how people see aging. You're not just part of Neuralink, you're part of a movement." Walt chuckled softly, eyes crinkling with warmth. "I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago." Reflecting on his journey, Walt realized he had crossed more than scientific frontiers. He had crossed the boundaries of fear, regret, and limitation. The breakthrough moment wasn't just about technology, it was about a human awakening. One night, after a busy day, Walt stood outside, gazing at the stars. He thought about Elon's vision of humanity becoming a multiplanetary species, about the infinite possibilities ahead. And he understood that his own story was a vital thread in this tapestry of exploration and transformation. He was no longer the man who felt invisible, left behind by time and change. He was a pioneer, a connector, a beacon for those still searching for their spark. The future was uncertain, but Walt faced it with courage and hope. Because breakthroughs weren't just moments, they were beginnings. Walt woke to the dull ache in his joints, a reminder that time was an unrelenting companion. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle glow on the workshop cluttered with prototypes, notebooks, and half-finished projects. Despite the promise of recent breakthroughs and the surge of hope, there was a quiet shadow that hovered, one born not from technology, but from the fragile nature of the human body and spirit. He rubbed his hands, feeling the tremor that had grown stronger over the past months. It was subtle but persistent, a whisper of mortality that no innovation could erase. The truth was unavoidable, Walt was aging, and with it came new challenges, some physical, some emotional. In the days following the lab's triumphant demonstration, the pressures had multiplied. Expectations soared, the spotlight sharpened, and beneath it all, Walt struggled to reconcile his fierce drive with the limitations his body imposed. The tremors sometimes made it difficult to work with the fine circuits he once handled with ease. Fatigue crept in earlier, and there were moments when the weight of years pressed heavily on his shoulders. But it wasn't just the physical toll. The emotional shadows were deeper. The fear of losing independence, the anxiety of becoming a burden, and the haunting question that had plagued him since his youth: had he waited too long? He found himself retreating more often to the quiet corners of his home, where memories mingled with regrets. The face of his late wife, Helen, appeared in his mind's eye, a reminder of love lost and years stolen by silence and distance. His fractured relationship with Judith, though healing, still held unspoken pain. The contrast between his public victories and private struggles felt stark, almost unbearable at times. One evening, as Walt sat alone by the fireplace, a familiar notification chimed on his phone. It was a message from Elon Musk: "Keep pushing. Shadows are part of the journey." Walt stared at the words, finding both comfort and challenge. Shadows were inevitable, but they could not define the path forward. The next day, Walt decided to confront his fears head-on. He reached out to a support group for seniors facing chronic conditions, a space where vulnerability was met with understanding. The first meeting was awkward. He was used to being the expert, the inventor, the man with answers. Here, he was just Walt, grappling with uncertainty like everyone else. But as stories unfolded, of pain, resilience, loss, and hope, he felt a quiet kinship. He shared his journey, not just the successes but the doubts and fears. The group listened, nodding, some with tears in their eyes. Walt realized that sharing his shadow made it less dark. Meanwhile, back at Neuralink, the team rallied around him. They adapted tasks to accommodate his tremors, providing assistance without diminishing his role. Kyle became a constant presence, balancing innovation with care, reminding Walt to honor his limits while pursuing his dreams. The interplay of vulnerability and strength created a new rhythm. One that was both humbling and empowering. One afternoon, Walt was invited to speak at a conference focused on aging and technology. On stage, he spoke candidly about facing shadows, how accepting weakness was not surrender but an act of courage. He challenged the audience to redefine what it meant to grow older, to embrace the fullness of human experience. His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations long overdue. After the talk, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "You gave me hope to keep going," she said. Walt smiled gently, feeling the profound power of connection. That night, he returned home, contemplating the balance between progress and patience. He knew that breakthroughs were not always grand moments but often quiet acts of acceptance and persistence. The shadows would come and go, but within them, he had found light. Inspired by this revelation, Walt began writing a journal, a place to document his journey with honesty and grace. He filled pages with reflections on aging, innovation, love, and resilience. Through words, he wove a narrative of hope that embraced imperfection. One entry stood out: "I am more than my limitations. I am a story still unfolding." As the weeks passed, Walt's health fluctuated, but his spirit remained unyielding. He continued to work, teach, and inspire, becoming a beacon for those navigating their own shadows. His story was no longer just about technology, it was about the human heart's capacity to endure, adapt, and shine. One chilly evening, Walt received an unexpected visit from Judith. The years of distance melted away in their embrace. They spoke late into the night, sharing dreams, regrets, and hopes for the future. Judith expressed pride in her father's journey, and Walt found peace in forgiveness and reconnection. Together, they planned new projects to bring Neuralink's benefits to underserved communities, weaving family and mission into a tapestry of purpose. Standing by the window afterward, Walt looked out at the stars twinkling against the night sky. He felt a deep gratitude, for the shadows that had taught him to appreciate the light, for the people who had walked beside him, and for the journey still ahead. The shadows were not the end. They were part of the story, complex, painful, and beautiful. And Walt was ready to face them with courage, hope, and love. Walt woke to a crisp morning, the golden sunlight spilling through his window like a promise. The air smelled faintly of pine and fresh earth, the scent of early autumn seeping into the small town where he'd found new purpose. Today was different. Not because of grand announcements or breakthroughs, but because of a quiet determination that had settled deep in his bones. After months of grappling with shadows and breakthroughs, Walt felt the pull of something larger, the urge to give back, to reach beyond his own journey and lift others alongside him. His mind raced with ideas sparked by Elon Musk's vision of pushing humanity forward, not just technologically, but socially and spiritually. Walt had realized that Neuralink was more than a tool, it was a catalyst for connection, empowerment, and transformation. The morning's agenda was a visit to a community center on the outskirts of town, where Walt was set to host a workshop for seniors interested in exploring Neuralink technology. The group was diverse: retired veterans, former teachers, artists, and people who, like Walt, had wrestled with the fear of being left behind. Walt prepared carefully, gathering materials, fine-tuning presentations, and rehearsing stories that would resonate. His goal was simple yet profound: to ignite curiosity and courage, to show that it was never too late to learn, to grow, to dream. The workshop began with hesitance. Many participants were skeptical, their years marked by hard lessons in disappointment and loss. But as Walt shared his own story, of doubt, struggle, and eventual breakthrough, the atmosphere shifted. He spoke not as a distant inventor but as a fellow traveler on the path of aging and renewal. Hands raised, questions poured in: how safe was the technology? Could it really help with memory loss or mobility? What about the risks? Walt answered honestly, balancing optimism with realism. He demonstrated how the Neuralink interface could translate thought into action, allowing a woman who'd lost movement in her hand to grasp a cup again. The room filled with gasps and smiles, the seed of possibility taking root. During breaks, Walt listened closely to stories from participants, tales of missed opportunities, lingering regrets, and a yearning for relevance. One man, Tom, a retired pilot, confided that he felt invisible, a relic in a fast-moving world. Walt met his gaze and said softly, "You're not invisible. You have wisdom and experience that technology alone can't replace. But together, they can open new doors." Inspired by these conversations, Walt proposed forming a peer support network, seniors helping seniors navigate the new technology, sharing knowledge, encouragement, and friendship. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and plans began to take shape. Outside the center, Walt and Kyle worked together, setting up a mobile Neuralink demonstration unit that could travel to different communities. They envisioned reaching rural areas, shelters, and underserved populations, places where hope could bloom in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, Walt's relationship with Judith flourished. Their shared vision for expanding Neuralink's reach became a source of bonding and healing. They collaborated on grant proposals, community outreach, and educational materials, blending innovation with heart. One afternoon, while walking through a park, Judith turned to Walt and said, "Dad, you've turned your pain into power. You're building something bigger than technology, you're building legacy." Walt smiled, the weight of years lifting with each step. As the months unfolded, Walt found himself invited to speak at universities, senior centers, and even tech conventions. His message was consistent: age was not a barrier but a foundation for growth. Innovation was a bridge to human connection, courage was the key to transformation. He became a mentor to younger engineers, urging them to design with empathy and inclusion. In one memorable session, Walt demonstrated a Neuralink interface that allowed a man with ALS to communicate with his family for the first time in years. The room erupted in tears and applause, a testament to the profound impact of technology guided by compassion. Yet Walt remained grounded. He continued journaling, reflecting on the interplay of progress and patience, of dreams and reality. His entries were filled with gratitude and resolve: each new connection is a victory. Each challenge, a chance to grow. One evening, after a long day, Walt sat by the fireplace with Kyle and Judith. The warmth of family surrounded him like a balm. They spoke of future goals, a global network of Neuralink users, advances in cognitive health, and deeper understanding of the brain's mysteries. Elon Musk's vision of a multiplanetary future seemed less distant when shared with loved ones who believed in the power of human resilience. As Walt looked around the room, he realized that reaching new heights wasn't about standing alone at the summit. It was about lifting others, building bridges across generations, and transforming fear into hope. The journey continued, unfolding, evolving, and inspiring. Walt's story was no longer just about a man reclaiming his purpose. It was about a movement, a collective leap toward a future where age and limitation bowed to courage and innovation. And with every breath, every heartbeat, Walt knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Walt sat quietly in his favorite chair, the worn leather comforting against the ache in his back. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, the golden light mingling with the weight of his thoughts. The breakthrough moments, the public acclaim, the community workshops, all were part of a whirlwind that now slowed, giving space to reflection and difficult questions. He was at a crossroads. The Neuralink project had evolved beyond anything he'd imagined. What started as a mission to restore function for individuals with disabilities had blossomed into a vision for human enhancement, cognitive expansion, and even telepathic communication. Yet with this expansion came profound ethical, social, and personal dilemmas. Walt felt the tension acutely, the balance between pushing boundaries and honoring human dignity, between technological possibility and unintended consequences. One of the most persistent questions echoed in his mind: how much change was too much? Could the essence of being human survive a world where minds were wired together, augmented, and intertwined with machines? His own body was a daily reminder of fragility. Despite the advances Neuralink promised, he wrestled with the limitations time had placed on him. The question wasn't just about science, it was about identity. Who was Walt beyond the inventions, the accolades, the public persona? And who would he become in a future shaped by technology that altered the mind itself? He recalled a recent conversation with Elon Musk during a strategy meeting. Elon's eyes sparkled with the thrill of exploration, pushing for rapid innovation, the next leap forward. But Walt voiced concerns others hesitated to say aloud: the risk of deepening inequalities, the challenge of consent and privacy, the danger of losing touch with the messy, beautiful imperfections of humanity. Elon listened, but the divide between their perspectives lingered. Later, Walt spent hours drafting an open letter to the Neuralink community, a call for thoughtful reflection, inclusive dialogue, and ethical stewardship. He wrote, "Technology must serve humanity, not replace it. Our quest is to enhance life, not erase what makes us human." The letter sparked debate. Some praised Walt's courage and wisdom, others accused him of caution that could stifle progress. Social media buzzed with passionate arguments. Walt felt the familiar sting of criticism but also the buoyancy of connection. He realized that change was never simple. It was messy, uncomfortable, and deeply human. Seeking clarity, Walt decided to return to his roots, to the small town where he had grown up and where the simplicity of life offered perspective. He rented a cabin near the lake, a place untouched by the fast pace of innovation and public scrutiny. There, surrounded by nature's steady rhythms, Walt reconnected with the memories and values that had shaped him. Walking along the water's edge, he thought of his father's steady hands, his mother's gentle wisdom, and the dreams he'd once held before fear and doubt had clouded them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walt sat with an old friend, Mary, a woman who had known him long before Neuralink, before public recognition. Mary listened patiently as Walt poured out his fears and hopes, his uncertainties about the future. She reminded him gently, "You've always been brave, not because you never feared, but because you kept going anyway. The crossroads you face now are part of that journey. Trust yourself." Her words were a balm, a reminder that courage was not absence of fear but the will to face it. Inspired, Walt began to draft a new chapter for Neuralink's mission, one rooted in humility, respect, and shared humanity. He proposed forming an independent ethics council, inviting voices from diverse backgrounds, scientists, philosophers, seniors, people with disabilities, and ethicists, to guide the technology's development. The proposal sparked renewed dialogue within Neuralink and the wider community. Walt saw firsthand the power of collective wisdom and the necessity of slowing down to listen deeply. Back at the lab, Walt found renewed energy in mentoring young engineers and researchers, encouraging them to question, to imagine, and to prioritize compassion alongside innovation. Kyle, ever the supportive son, helped Walt balance vision with pragmatism, reminding him that change was a marathon, not a sprint. As weeks turned to months, Walt witnessed the fruits of this thoughtful approach. Neuralink's advancements became more accessible, user-friendly, and aligned with real human needs. Stories emerged of people reclaiming independence, reconnecting with loved ones, and even discovering new ways to learn and create. Walt's heart swelled with pride, not just for the technology but for the people whose lives it touched. One evening, as Walt prepared to leave the cabin and return to the city, he sat by the fire reflecting on his journey. The crossroads he had feared were not a sign of weakness but a testament to growth. Change was not a destination but a continual process, a dance between hope and humility, ambition and care. He whispered to the flickering flames, "I am ready. Ready to face whatever came next, armed not only with invention but with wisdom." The future was uncertain, but Walt had found peace in the crossroads, knowing that the path forward was as much about heart as it was about mind. Walt stared out at the city skyline, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the familiar rooftops and streets he had walked countless times. The Neuralink headquarters buzzed with activity, but today, in the quiet of his office, a different kind of tension gripped him. It was the moment before a leap, not just technological, but deeply personal. After years of struggle, invention, reflection, and rebuilding relationships, Walt was preparing for a bold step that could redefine everything he had worked for. He felt the tremor in his hand and the ache in his joints, reminders of his mortality. Yet, alongside the vulnerability was a fierce spark ignited by Elon Musk's relentless drive and vision. This leap of faith was a chance to embrace uncertainty, to trust in the unknown, and to prove that age was no barrier to transformation. The decision was to undergo the Neuralink implant himself, not as a subject or symbol, but as an active participant in the future he had helped create. It was more than a scientific trial, it was an act of courage and conviction. Walt's journey had been marked by moments of doubt and fear, but he had come to see those shadows as invitations to grow. As he prepared for the procedure, memories flooded his mind, the late nights tinkering in his garage, the strained conversations with Judith, the moments of quiet loss for Helen, and the countless times Elon's words had challenged him to break free from limitations. Now, he stood at the threshold of becoming more than a witness to change, he would become a living example. The morning of the implant was calm but electric. Walt arrived at the Neuralink clinic, greeted by the familiar faces of colleagues who had become family. Kyle held his hand briefly, offering silent support. The medical team moved with practiced precision, their confidence easing Walt's nerves. As the procedure began, Walt focused on his breath, grounding himself in the present. The implant promised enhanced cognitive function, the ability to communicate faster, and the potential to alleviate some of the physical symptoms that had troubled him. But it also held the unknown. The risks, the challenges, and the adjustments ahead. Hours later, in the recovery room, Walt awoke to a strange new clarity. His thoughts felt sharper, his senses heightened, and for the first time in years, a tingling sense of connection pulsed within him. Over the following days, the effects unfolded in subtle but profound ways. He found himself recalling memories with vivid detail, feeling bursts of mental energy that allowed him to work longer and with renewed focus. The tremor in his hand softened, replaced by a steady strength. Yet the true breakthrough was deeper, a feeling of unity between mind and machine, a blending of human resilience and technological power that defied the usual boundaries. Walt spent hours testing the new capabilities, communicating effortlessly with devices, controlling computers with mere thoughts, and even experimenting with real-time translation of ideas into text and images. The sense of liberation was exhilarating, yet humbling. He knew this was only the beginning. Word of Walt's implant spread quickly, sparking waves of hope and debate. Some hailed it as a triumph, a beacon of what was possible when courage met innovation. Others raised concerns about ethics, privacy, and the implications for identity. Walt welcomed the dialogue, believing that transparency and honesty were essential as humanity stepped into uncharted territory. As he shared his experience publicly, Walt's vulnerability struck a chord. He spoke openly about fears, hopes, and the deeply human journey behind the science. "This is not about becoming something else," he said. "It's about becoming more fully ourselves, embracing the gifts of technology without losing sight of our humanity." The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people around the world, seniors inspired to try new technologies, families hopeful for loved ones with disabilities, skeptics curious to learn more. Walt's story became a catalyst, sparking a movement toward embracing change with courage and compassion. In the weeks that followed, Walt continued to push boundaries, leading research, mentoring new innovators, and deepening his connection with Judith and Kyle. Together, they envisioned a future where Neuralink could help not only individuals but entire communities thrive. One quiet evening, as Walt sat with Judith watching the sunset, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The road had been filled with trials and triumphs, shadows and light. He thought of Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Walt realized that leap of faith was not a single moment but a continuous choice, to embrace possibility, to face fear, and to keep moving forward. As the sky deepened into twilight, Walt whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." The future awaited, with all its challenges, wonders, and promise. And Walt was ready to soar. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?